and welcome to Crowvane Manor. Wherever you are, and whatever kind of night it's been, you've come to the right place to slow down. Let the world go quiet for a while. Out here, none of it needs your attention. Many of you return to these rooms night after night, and I'm grateful for that. There's a reason you keep coming back. The stories kept inside these walls aren't quite like the ones you'll hear anywhere else. Before we begin, leave a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight. I always enjoy reading them. And if these stories stay with you, a like and a subscribe help more than you know. Now get comfortable, breathe slow, and let's open the door together. I was 12 and lived in a rural area about 20 minutes outside of a tiny place in northern British Columbia, Canada, called Salmon Valley. Calling it a town almost felt generous. It was more like a small dot on the map, the kind of place people only knew about if they lived nearby or had a reason to pass through. There were long roads, scattered houses, thick forests, and more open land than people. Once you got away from the few buildings and the main road, it felt like the rest of the world disappeared. My family rented around 150 acres of land there. Only a small part of it was cleared. We had space for horses and a few sheep, some fencing, a yard around the house, and a rough path that led through the property. But most of the land was untouched. It was thick brush, tall grass, fallen trees, wet ground, berry bushes, and forest that seemed to go on forever. The trees stretched for miles in every direction. If you stood at the edge of the cleared field and looked out, it was easy to imagine that the woods had no end. For an outdoorsy kid, it was amazing. I spent almost every summer outside. I would get up early, eat something quick, and disappear into the woods for hours. I knew the land around the house better than I knew the roads in town. I knew where the berry bushes grew, where the ground stayed muddy after rain, where you could find animal tracks, and where the trees grew close enough together that the sunlight barely reached the ground. I knew which places were safe to walk through and which places made me nervous. I knew where the horses liked to wander and where the sheep stayed close to the fence. I knew the sound of birds calling from the trees, the sound of wind through spruce branches, and the sound of something small moving through dry leaves. I had seen deer, foxes, rabbits, squirrels, birds, and plenty of tracks from animals I never saw directly. The forest was not just the place behind the house. It was my whole world at that age. I made little paths through the brush and pretended I was exploring some wild, unknown place. I found strange rocks and old pieces of wood and carried them home like they were treasures. I climbed over fallen trees, followed animal trails, and sat quietly near the berry bushes to see what would come out. I knew there were bears in the area, of course. Everyone did. We were taught to be careful. We knew not to surprise them, not to get between a mother and her cubs, and not to stay near places where bears had been feeding. But when you are 12, even danger can feel like part of the adventure. One year, a hippie couple parked an old bus on our property for the winter. I do not remember every detail about how that happened. I just remember that they were different from most of the people around us. They had long hair, old clothes, and a bus that looked like it had been driven across half the country. It was not in great shape, but they seemed to have made it homey. They parked it off to one side of the property, far enough from our house that they had privacy, but close enough that we could see it from the clearing. They were friendly enough. They mostly kept to themselves, but I remember seeing them outside sometimes, sitting near the bus or doing things around their little area. They had a dog named Mickey. Mickey was a medium-sized dog, mostly white and black, with a red collar. He was friendly, but he barked at everything. He barked at cars, birds, people walking by, horses moving too close to the fence, and anything he heard in the trees. The couple kept him tied outside near their bus. He had a chain connected to a sturdy fence post and a doghouse nearby where he could get out of the weather. At the time, I never thought much about him being tied up. He had room to move around, and he was always there, barking or wagging his tail whenever someone passed near him. He seemed like part of the property after a while. When I went outside, I would sometimes hear him before I saw him. Then, the first snow came. In northern British Columbia, the first real snow can change everything overnight. The ground goes from dark and wet to completely white. Every branch, fence line, and roof gets covered. The forest becomes quiet in a different way. Tracks become visible everywhere. You can see where rabbits crossed the yard, where deer moved through the field, where birds landed, and where anything else had been. That year, the first snow came in October. It was not a huge storm at first, but it snowed enough to cover the ground completely. The next morning, the whole property looked clean and untouched. The trees were heavy with snow, and the fields had that smooth white look that only lasts before people or animals start moving through it. That was when Mickey disappeared. The dog was gone. At first, I thought maybe the couple had taken him somewhere. But then people started looking around, and it became clear that he was not simply off the chain or wandering near the bus. Mickey was gone. His chain was gone too. The fence post he had been tied to was gone. Not broken, not leaning over, not pulled loose and left nearby. Gone, the dog, the chain, and the whole post had vanished. I remember walking out there and seeing the empty spot where he had been. The doghouse was still there. The snow around it showed Mickey's tracks from before he disappeared. You could see where he had walked in circles near the edge of his chain's reach. You could see old marks in the snow where he had paced around, probably barking at something during the night. But there were no tracks leading away. There were no human footprints, no animal tracks, no drag marks, no place where the post had been pulled across the snow. Nothing. The snow around the doghouse was untouched beyond the small area Mickey had moved around in. It looked like he had simply vanished straight up into the sky. That was the only way I could describe it. I was 12, and I knew that was impossible. I knew there had to be some normal answer. Maybe someone had taken him. Maybe the chain had been removed and the post pulled out before the snow got too deep. Maybe a bear had gotten him somehow. Maybe there was a way he had escaped that no one could see. But none of it explained the snow. If someone had taken Mickey, they would have left tracks. If an animal had dragged him away, there would have been marks. If the post had been ripped out and carried or pulled off, there would have been something in the snow. Even if the wind had blown snow over tracks, there should have been a disturbed patch, a trail, something. There was nothing. Just the doghouse, the empty place where the post had been, and the snow. The adults talked about it for a while, but eventually life moved on. The hippie couple stayed through the winter, as far as I remember, though I do not remember seeing them much after that. The disappearance of Mickey became one of those strange things people mentioned occasionally, but never solved. Winter passed. The snow melted. The ground turned muddy, then green again. The forest came back to life. The birds returned. The berry bushes grew thick. The same places I had explored the summer before became familiar again. And, like always, I started roaming the forest. By then, I had grown a little more confident. I was still a kid, but I felt like I knew the land. I knew where I could go without getting lost. I knew roughly how far I could walk before I needed to turn back. I had my usual areas, especially around the berry bushes, where I liked to spend time looking for animal tracks or just sitting quietly. But that summer, a bear moved into my usual area. I never saw it directly at first. I saw signs, fresh tracks, broken branches, places where berry bushes had been torn apart. There were piles of scat and claw marks on a tree near one of the trails I used. I knew enough to stay away. Even though I loved exploring, I was not stupid enough to keep hanging around where a bear was feeding. So I started going farther into the forest. At first it was exciting. I found places I had never seen before. There were old fallen trees covered in moss, small clearings where sunlight came through, and areas where the ground was soft with layers of wet leaves. The forest became thicker the farther I went. The paths I knew faded away. The familiar sounds from near the property disappeared. I still told myself I was not going too far. But one afternoon, I pushed farther than I ever had before. I had been walking for a long time. The trees were dense, and I had to step over roots, branches, and wet patches of ground. There were places where I had to push through brush with both hands because the vegetation was so thick. I could still tell roughly which direction home was, but I had gone far enough that the idea of turning back felt like a long walk. The forest was quiet, but not unusually quiet at first. I could hear birds. I could hear insects. I could hear leaves moving lightly in the breeze. Then I came across a break in the trees. At first, I thought it might be another small meadow or a place where a tree had fallen years earlier. But when I stepped closer, I realized it was a clearing. Not just any clearing. It was perfectly circular. The trees and brush stopped in a clean, rounded shape, almost like someone had drawn a circle in the forest and removed everything inside it. The clearing was not huge, but it was big enough to stand in comfortably. The ground inside looked flatter than the forest floor around it. There was less brush, less deadwood, less mess. It was strange enough that I stopped at the edge and looked around. Then I saw something glinting near the center. The sun was hitting it through the trees, and it flashed for a second. I was 12, curious, and used to finding things in the woods. So naturally, I walked toward it. As I got closer, I realized it was metal, a chain. It lay on the ground in the center of the clearing. The chain was attached to a fence post. The fence post was attached to a red collar. I stopped. For a second, I did not understand what I was looking at. My mind saw the pieces separately. Chain, post, collar. Then I recognized the collar. It was Mickey's. Around the post and chain was fur. White and black fur. It was scattered all around the center of the clearing in a rough circle, like someone had thrown it outward from the post. It was not just a small patch. It looked like an explosion of fur. The white and black pieces were mixed into the grass, dirt, and leaves all around the post and chain. I remember standing there completely still. I thought about poor Mickey. The first explanation that came to my mind was a bear. I knew bears could drag animals away. I knew predators could kill dogs. I thought maybe Mickey had been attacked, somehow carried far into the woods, and whatever had happened had left the collar, chain, and post there. But that did not make much sense either. How could a bear take an entire fence post, chain, and dog all that distance without leaving a trail? How could it drag a post through the snow and leave no marks? Why was the fur arranged so evenly around the post? Why was the clearing perfectly round? Still, I was 12. I wanted a normal answer. I figured I would take the post and chain home to show my dad. Maybe he could explain it. Maybe he would know what animal had done it. Maybe the people living in the bus had moved Mickey themselves, and this was some strange place they had put his things after he died. I stepped closer. I reached toward the post. Then the entire forest went silent. It happened so fast that I noticed it before I could even think about it. The birds stopped. The wind stopped. The insects stopped. Everything stopped. It was not the ordinary quiet of being alone in the woods. It was not the peaceful kind of silence that comes when you pause and listen. This was a thick, sickening silence, like the forest had suddenly held its breath. The hairs on my arms lifted. Even now, more than 20 years later, I can remember that feeling so clearly that it makes my skin prickle. My stomach dropped. Every instinct in my body told me the same thing. Leave. Do not touch it. Do not look around. Do not stay there. Just leave. I did. I turned around and started back the way I had come. At first, I walked quickly. I did not run right away because the forest was thick and uneven, and I knew I could trip or get caught on branches. But I moved fast. I pushed through brush, stepped over roots, and tried to follow the path I had made through the trees. I was not quiet. There was no way to be quiet. The underbrush was too dense. Every step cracked something. Every branch brushed against my jacket. Every time I pushed through a bush, leaves snapped and twigs broke. But underneath the sound of my own movement, I heard something else. Something behind me. At first, I thought it was an echo of my own footsteps. Then, I realized it was not. When I stepped, I heard a step behind me. When I pushed through brush, I heard brush moving behind me. When I broke a twig, I heard another twig snap somewhere back in the trees. It was not copying me exactly, but it was following my rhythm. I would take 3 quick steps, and something behind me would move 3 times. I would stop, and it would stop. I would move again, and it would move again. The sound was close enough that I could tell it was not far away. Maybe 10 feet behind me. Maybe less. I did not turn around. I wanted to, but I could not make myself do it. Something inside me knew that looking would make everything worse. I kept walking faster, trying to control my breathing and not panic. The forest stayed silent. No birds, no wind, no normal animal sounds. Nothing except me moving through the brush and something else moving behind me. There were moments when I stopped completely, hoping I had imagined it. Each time, whatever was behind me stopped too. I could not see it. I could not hear it breathing. I could not hear heavy footsteps. But I could feel it. That sounds impossible to explain, but I knew I was being watched. I knew something was out there in the trees behind me. It was not just following me by accident. It was moving when I moved and stopping when I stopped. It felt like it was hunting me. The walk back felt endless. I kept thinking I should be close to home, but the forest seemed bigger than it had ever been. Every time I thought I recognized a tree or a patch of ground, it looked wrong. I felt like I was trapped in the same stretch of woods, moving forward, but never getting out. The fear got worse every minute. I started moving faster. Then, faster. I did not care anymore if I made noise. I did not care if I scratched my arms or tore my clothes. I just wanted to reach the clearing near the property. I wanted to see the open field. I wanted to see the fences. I wanted to be somewhere that was not surrounded by trees. Finally, I saw a break ahead. Light, open, space. The edge of the forest. I reached the clearing and ran. I ran as hard as I could. There were 2 barbed wire fences between the forest and home. Normally, I would have climbed through carefully or found the places where the wire was easier to cross. That day, I did not slow down. I jumped the first one. Then I jumped the second. I caught myself badly on the wire and tore my leg or arm. I do not remember which one now, but I still have the scar from it. I barely felt it at the time. Adrenaline had taken over completely. I kept running until I reached the house. I did not stop until I was inside. I do not remember exactly what I said to anyone. I know I did not tell my dad the full truth. I never told him about the clearing. I never told him about Mickey's collar, the chain, the post, or the fur in that perfect circle. I never told him about the silence or the thing following me through the forest. I was terrified he would make me take him back there. That was the part I could not handle. I felt deep down that whatever had been in that forest did not want me to leave. I felt like I had walked into something's territory, somewhere I was not supposed to be. And I believed that if I ever went back to that clearing, it would not let me leave again. After that day, the forest outside my home was never safe to me. I still had to walk out to the fields sometimes. I still had to help with the horses or sheep. I still had to look toward the tree line every day. But I could not see it the same way anymore. The woods no longer felt like a place for adventure. They felt like a place that was watching. Every time I stood in the field and looked at the trees, I could feel something out there, waiting, not chasing me, not showing itself, but waiting for me to wander back into its hunting grounds. I never did. And even now, years later, I can still remember the exact feeling of that silence settling over the forest the moment I reached for Mickey's post. I can still remember the sound of something stepping behind me. And I can still remember knowing, without seeing it once, that I was not alone. I was probably 16 or 17 years old when this happened. It was a long time ago now, and some of the smaller details have become fuzzy with age, but the main event is still burned into my memory. Even after all these years, I can picture it clearly. It remains one of the strangest things I have ever witnessed, and despite trying countless times to come up with a reasonable explanation, I still have no idea what I actually saw that night. I grew up in a very small town in California. When people think of California, they usually imagine crowded cities, beaches, traffic, and endless suburbs. Where I lived was nothing like that. Our town was rural, quiet, and isolated. Everybody knew everybody. If someone new moved into town, people would usually know about it within a day or two. News traveled fast because there simply weren't that many people around. The roads outside town were long stretches of darkness at night. There weren't street lights lining the roads like you see in cities. Once the sun went down, the world became almost completely black. The only light came from houses scattered across the countryside or from passing vehicles, which wasn't often. Back then, I was at the age where spending time with friends was basically my entire social life. One evening, I decided to drive to a friend's house in the next town over. It wasn't a difficult drive, but it wasn't exactly close either. I had to take several back roads before eventually reaching the freeway, and then continue from there. I remember leaving home late. It must have been close to midnight. In my town, that meant there was virtually nobody around. Honestly, even after 8 at night, the roads were usually empty. Most people stayed home, and businesses closed early. By midnight, the entire area felt abandoned. I got into my car and started driving. The night was calm and warm. It was the middle of summer, one of those dry California nights where there isn't a cloud in the sky, and rain is the last thing anyone expects. The air was still. There was no wind, no storms, nothing unusual at all. For the first couple of miles, everything seemed normal. My headlights cut through the darkness ahead of me as I drove along the empty road. The familiar route stretched out before me, surrounded by fields and open land. Occasionally, I passed a mailbox or a distant farmhouse, but otherwise there was very little to see. I was maybe 2 miles from my house when something appeared in the distance. At first, I thought it was just shadows. Then I realized there were people walking along the side of the road. That immediately caught my attention. Seeing a single person walking that late at night would have been unusual enough. Seeing multiple people was even stranger. As I got closer, I began trying to make sense of what I was looking at. There appeared to be one adult walking in front. Behind the adult was a line of children, A lot of children. Even now, I couldn't tell you the exact number. Maybe 8, maybe 10, maybe more. What I remember most clearly was that they were walking single file, one behind another, almost like a preschool class on a field trip. The sight was so unexpected that I instinctively slowed down. The closer I got, the stranger it looked. The adult appeared to be a woman, although I couldn't be completely certain. I only caught brief glimpses as my headlights illuminated them. Something about the shape of the person, the way they walked, or maybe the side profile, made me think it was female. What really stood out, though, were the children. Every one of them appeared to be wearing bright-colored raincoats. Yellow, red, blue, bright colors that reflected in my headlights. All of them had their hoods pulled up. None of their faces were visible. At first, I thought maybe I was mistaken. Maybe they weren't raincoats. Maybe it was some other type of clothing. But the more I looked, the more certain I became. They genuinely looked like raincoats, which made absolutely no sense. This was California in the middle of summer. Rain wasn't expected. There hadn't been any storms. The sky was perfectly clear. Yet here was a woman leading a group of children down a dark road in the middle of the night, while all of them wore rain gear. The entire scene felt wrong. Not necessarily frightening at first, just wrong, like seeing something completely out of place. I slowed my car almost to a crawl. My headlights illuminated the group as I approached. The woman kept walking. The children kept walking. None of them looked toward my vehicle. None of them reacted. I rolled down my window. Concern started replacing confusion. My first thought wasn't that something supernatural was happening. My first thought was that these people needed help. Who walks down an unlit country road at midnight with a huge group of children? Why weren't they carrying flashlights? Where were they going? Where had they come from? The situation felt unsafe, so I called out to them. I asked if they needed help. The woman didn't respond. She didn't even turn her head. The children continued walking in silence. I frowned and called out again, louder this time. Still nothing. Not one person reacted. Not a glance, not a wave, not a single acknowledgement. The complete lack of response unsettled me more than anything else. Normally, if someone calls out from a vehicle, people at least look, even if they don't want help, even if they're annoyed, even if they're suspicious. Human beings naturally react when someone speaks directly to them. But this group didn't. They just kept moving forward, step after step, single file, silent. At that point, I had practically stopped the car. I remember sitting there watching them. The headlights lit them clearly enough that they should have known I was there. My engine was running. My voice had carried through the night air. Yet it was as if none of them could hear me. Or perhaps none of them wanted to acknowledge me. I can't really explain the feeling that came over me. It wasn't pure fear. Not yet. It was confusion mixed with unease. The entire situation felt unnatural. The woman never turned around. The children never broke formation. Nobody spoke. Nobody looked up. Nobody reacted. After several awkward moments, I finally started moving again. There wasn't much else I could do. This was before I owned a cell phone. If this had happened today, I probably would have called someone immediately. But back then, that wasn't an option. So I continued driving toward the freeway. The whole way there, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd just seen. The image kept replaying in my mind. The raincoats, the hoods, the silence, the endless line of children walking through complete darkness. The closer I got to the freeway, the more concerned I became. Eventually, I reached a gas station near the on-ramp. As soon as I arrived, I went inside. I asked to use their phone. Then, I called the police. I explained everything I had seen. The dispatcher listened carefully. I described the road. I described the adult. I described the children. I explained that they were walking in complete darkness without flashlights. I told them how unusual the entire thing seemed. The dispatcher thanked me and said someone would investigate. After making the call, I continued on to my friend's house. But even after arriving, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The image lingered in my mind all night. The next day, I expected to hear some explanation. Maybe a church group, maybe a camping trip, maybe some strange local event. Surely there had to be a logical reason. But no explanation ever came. Days passed, then weeks. Nothing. I started asking around town. The more people I spoke to, the stranger the story became. Nobody knew who those people were. Nobody knew about any group traveling through the area. Nobody knew of any family with that many children. Nobody remembered seeing anything similar. And in a town that small, that mattered. People noticed strangers, especially large groups of strangers. Yet nobody seemed to know anything. I spoke with neighbors. I spoke with family friends. I spoke with people who had lived there their entire lives. Nothing. Every conversation ended the same way. A confused look, a shrug, and the same answer. No idea. That should have made me feel better. Instead, it made me more uncomfortable. The group had been real. I knew what I saw. I wasn't dreaming. I wasn't imagining things. Yet nobody could account for them. Months later, I happened to run into the sheriff. The encounter reminded me of the phone call. Curiosity got the better of me. So I asked him about it. I told him I was the one who had reported the group walking along the road that night. To my surprise, he remembered the call. That immediately got my attention. He confirmed that deputies had gone out to investigate. I waited for him to explain what they found. Instead, he simply shook his head. They hadn't found anyone. No woman, no children, no group, nothing, according to him. They searched the area and came up empty. The people I'd reported had apparently vanished. I remember feeling a chill when he told me that. Not because I thought something paranormal had happened, but because it removed the only explanation I had been holding on to. For months, I assumed authorities had found the group and determined everything was fine. Maybe they simply hadn't bothered updating me. But now, I knew differently. The deputies had looked. And they hadn't found anyone. The road itself didn't offer many options. There weren't neighborhoods nearby. There weren't businesses open at midnight. There weren't sidewalks leading into subdivisions. It was mostly open land. Yet somehow an adult and a line of children had disappeared before law enforcement arrived. I never learned anything else. No follow-up, no news reports, no explanation, nothing. Life moved on. I graduated. I got older. I eventually left that small town behind. But the memory stayed with me. Even today, years later, I still think about it. Every detail remains vivid. The darkness, the empty road, the brightly colored raincoats, the silent line of children, the woman who never looked back, the complete absence of any response when I called out. And perhaps most unsettling of all, the fact that nobody ever figured out who they were. For years afterward, every time I drove home late at night, I found myself scanning the roadside. Part of me expected to see them again. I never did. Not once. The roads remained empty. The nights remained quiet. The strange group never reappeared. Sometimes I try to come up with explanations. Maybe it was some kind of religious group. Maybe it was a late-night activity I simply didn't understand. Maybe they left the road before deputies arrived. Maybe there was a perfectly ordinary reason for everything. But then, I remember the details, the complete silence, the lack of flashlights, the raincoats in the middle of a dry California summer, the way none of them reacted to my voice, and the fact that nobody in town recognized them. No matter how much time passes, those details never quite fit together. I still don't know who they were. I still don't know where they came from. And I still don't know where they were headed that night. All I know is that on a quiet summer night, just before midnight, on an empty country road outside a small California town, I passed a woman leading a long line of hooded children through the darkness. They never looked at me. They never answered me. They never acknowledged my presence at all. And by the time anyone went looking for them, they were simply gone. My friend and I liked to take the back roads to find spots to hike. We were never the kind of people who needed a trail map, a marked parking lot, or a sign telling us exactly where to go. Sometimes we would see a ridge in the distance, a patch of forest that looked untouched, or a hill with a view that caught our attention. And that was enough. We would pull over somewhere safe, grab our water, and start walking. Half the time, we had no real plan beyond seeing what was over the next rise. We lived in the region, so we were used to being outdoors. We knew the desert, the trees, the dry hills, the rocky slopes, and the long stretches of road where you could drive for miles without seeing another person. We knew the weather could change fast. We knew not to wander too far when daylight was running out. We knew the kind of animals that lived around us and the signs they left behind. Elk, deer, coyotes, bears, mountain lions, rabbits, birds of prey. Even the smaller creatures that stayed hidden unless you were paying close attention. We had seen tracks, scat, feathers, bones, antlers, and old remains plenty of times. That was part of why this one thing bothered us so much. We had gone out that day with no big goal in mind. It was one of those afternoons where the weather was nice enough to be outside, but there was still a chill in the air once the sun started getting low. The sky had been clear when we left, bright and open, with that deep blue color that makes the mountains and trees look sharper than usual. We had driven around for a while, taking roads we had not been down before, stopping whenever something looked interesting. At one point, we found a place where the land opened up, and we could see the peaks in the distance. We parked, climbed a slope, and spent some time up there just looking around. It was quiet in a good way. There was wind moving through the trees and the occasional bird calling somewhere far off, but otherwise it felt like the whole world had gone still. We talked about random things, joked around, and took our time because neither of us had anywhere we needed to be right away. That was probably the mistake. By the time we started heading back, the sun was already dropping behind the mountains. We both knew we should have left earlier, but it is easy to ignore that feeling when you are used to driving around and exploring. You tell yourself that you know the area. You tell yourself that the road will eventually connect to something familiar. You tell yourself you will be back on pavement soon enough. We were taking the Forest Service roads behind the San Francisco peaks. Those roads can be rough during the day, but at night they feel completely different. The gravel is uneven, the turns are sharp, and some stretches are narrow enough that you have to slow down just to avoid damaging the vehicle. There are places where the trees come close to the road, places where the ground drops away on one side, and places where the road disappears into darkness so completely that your headlights feel useless beyond a few feet. At first, we were still talking and laughing. The truck bounced over potholes and loose rocks while we tried to remember which turns we had taken earlier. The sky was turning darker by the minute. The last bit of sunlight was gone, but there was still a faint glow above the horizon. The trees were becoming nothing more than black shapes on either side of the road. I remember looking out the window and thinking that we really should have been out of there already. There is a certain kind of darkness in the woods that does not exist in town. In town, even when it is late, There are lights from houses, street lamps, passing cars, signs, and windows. You are never fully alone, because there is always some sign of people nearby. Out on those roads, there was nothing. No houses, no other cars, no headlights behind us, no lights ahead. Just the road, the trees, the cold air, and the sound of tires grinding over dirt and rock. We had the headlights on high beams, but even those did not reach very far around the bends. Every curve looked like it could hide anything. A deer, an elk, a fallen tree, another vehicle stuck in the road. We were driving slow enough to be careful, but still trying to make decent time because neither of us wanted to be back there after full dark. Then I saw something white off the side of the road. At first, it barely registered. It was just a flash of pale color in the headlights, something bright against the dark ground and brush. I turned my head and looked back through the window as we passed it. For a second, I thought it might have been a piece of trash or an old sign, but it did not look right. It was too far off the road, and the white had a shape to it. I told my friend to stop. He looked at me and asked what I saw. I said I thought I saw bones. He slowed down, backed up carefully, and stopped near the spot. The road was narrow and uneven, and the truck rocked slightly as it came to a stop. We both looked out the windows, trying to see through the trees and brush. There, a short distance off the road, was something pale on the ground. At first, I got excited. We had found elk skeletons before. Not full ones, but enough to know what we were looking at when we came across bones in the woods. Sometimes you would find a skull with antlers still attached, or a large piece of a skeleton that had been left behind after an animal died. It was always interesting to see, especially when it was something big like an elk. Antlers were cool. Skulls were cool. We had talked before about finding something that might be worth keeping, something old and unusual that we could clean up and display. That was what I thought this was. Maybe it was an elk skull. Maybe it was a deer. Maybe it was something we had not seen before. The bones looked bright enough in the headlights that I thought it had to be something decent sized. I told my friend I was going to check it out. He stayed in the truck at first while I got out. The cold hit me immediately. It had gotten much colder since the sun went down, and the air had that dry, sharp feeling that makes your nose burn when you breathe too deeply. I shut the door and stood still for a second, listening. The road was quiet. The truck engine was still running, low and steady behind me. Beyond that, there was nothing. The thing was farther from the road than I had expected. It was not right beside the shoulder. It sat out in the brush and dirt, maybe 20 or 30 feet away, where the headlights only reached in broken pieces through the trees. I had to walk carefully because the ground was uneven. There were loose rocks, dead branches, small holes, and patches of dry grass that caught around my boots. As I walked closer, my excitement started to fade. Something about the shape was wrong. At first, I could not explain why. I just knew that it was not looking like the elk skull I had expected to find. Elk skulls have a certain shape. Deer skulls do too. Even if you only see them from one angle, you can usually recognize the long face, the position of the eyes, the place where the antlers would grow. This did not look like that. I slowed down. The closer I got, the more I could see. It was definitely bones. That part was not in question. They were old, dry, and pale, scattered together in a way that made it look like the animal had died there a long time ago. Some pieces were half covered by dirt and leaves. Some were exposed clearly enough that the moonlight and headlights made them stand out. But the skull was what stopped me. I stood there, staring at it, and for a few seconds, I could not move. It did not look like anything I had ever seen before. The skull was larger than a dog's, but not huge like an elk. It was a decent size, bigger than most animals you would expect to see lying around in that part of the woods. The shape was strange. The front of it seemed too long in one place and too flat in another. It almost looked like it had some kind of bill or beak, but not exactly. It was not shaped like a bird skull. It was not shaped like a coyote or fox. It was not shaped like a deer, elk, bear, or mountain lion. It had a face, if that makes sense, but not one that looked familiar. I just stood there, trying to understand what I was looking at. For a moment, I thought maybe it was damaged. Maybe the skull had broken over time, and the missing pieces made it look strange. Maybe another animal had chewed on it. Maybe it had been exposed to weather for years and years, changing the way it looked. I leaned closer without touching it and tried to make sense of the eye sockets, the jaw, the front of the skull. But the more I looked, the less it made sense. I remember feeling my stomach drop. It was not a normal fear at first. It was more like confusion so strong that it became uncomfortable. My mind kept trying to match it to something I knew, and nothing fit. Every animal I could think of had some feature that was missing or wrong. I kept expecting the answer to suddenly become obvious, but it never did. Behind me, my friend called out from the truck. He asked what it was. I did not answer right away. That was enough for him to notice something was off. He got out of the truck and started walking toward me. I waved him over, but I do not think I even said anything. I just wanted someone else to see it. I needed to know whether I was overthinking it, or whether it truly looked as strange as I thought it did. He walked up beside me and looked down. For a few seconds, he did not say anything either. Then, he said, "What the fuck?" That was it. Not a joke. Not a laugh. Not some casual comment about finding something cool. Just, what the fuck? I looked at him, and he looked at me, and we both had the same expression. We were trying to figure it out, but neither of us had any clue what we were looking at. We had grown up in the region. We knew the animals around there. We knew what an elk skull looked like. We knew deer, coyotes, wolves, bears, mountain lions, cows, horses, goats, and all the other things people might assume it could have been. We had seen enough bones before to recognize the general shape of most animals. Even if it was something uncommon, we should have been able to guess. But this did not look like anything. The front of the skull was what got me the most. It had that weird, almost bill shape, but it was not a bill. It was like something had the beginning of a beak without actually being a bird. The head looked too narrow in some places and too wide in others. The bones around the face were arranged in a way that made it look almost alien. That sounds dramatic, but there is no other way to put it. It looked wrong. Not just unusual, not just damaged. Wrong. My friend crouched down a little, keeping his distance. He did not touch it. Neither of us wanted to touch it by then. The excitement of finding something interesting had completely disappeared. The longer we stood there, the more uncomfortable I felt. There was something about being out there that made it worse. We were alone on a Forest Service road after dark. There were no other vehicles, no signal we could trust, no people nearby. The woods around us were completely quiet. The truck headlights were the only real light, and they made everything outside their beam look even darker. My friend told me not to touch it. He said it seriously. Again, we were indigenous, and we had both grown up hearing stories, warnings, and beliefs from the people around us. Some things are not meant to be taken. Some things are not meant to be disturbed. It was not even about being superstitious in that moment. It was more like instinct. The whole situation felt off, and touching it felt like a bad idea. I did not argue. I had already been thinking the same thing. We looked around us then, And that was when the fear really started to settle in. Before, all of our attention had been on the skull. But when we lifted our heads and looked around, we realized how dark it had become. The trees stood around us in every direction. The road behind us disappeared into blackness. The truck lights lit up only a small part of the ground. Everything beyond that was hidden. I suddenly had the strong feeling that we should not be standing there. I do not know why. Maybe it was just the isolation. Maybe it was because of the bones. Maybe it was because neither of us could explain what we had found. But I felt exposed, like we had walked into a place we were not supposed to be. My friend looked toward the road and said we needed to go. I agreed immediately. We did not take pictures. We did not pick anything up. We did not spend another 10 minutes examining it. We just turned around and walked back toward the truck faster than we had walked over. I remember trying not to look into the trees. Every dark shape looked like it could be something standing there. Every branch seemed to move when I looked away. The wind had picked up a little, and it made the trees creak softly. But in that moment, every sound felt louder than it should have. We got back to the truck and got inside. My friend locked the doors right away. I did too, even though I knew it probably did not matter. It was just automatic. One of those things you do when your body is telling you that you are not safe, even if your brain cannot explain why. He pulled out onto the road and started driving. Neither of us talked for a minute. The truck moved slowly over the rough road, headlights bouncing over the trees and rocks. I kept looking back through the rear window, but I could not see anything. The darkness swallowed the place where we had found the bones almost immediately. After a while, my friend finally asked me what I thought it was. I said I had no idea. We started throwing out possibilities, but none of them felt right. Maybe it was some kind of animal from a farm. Maybe someone had dumped bones there. Maybe it was an old skull that had been broken and weathered in a way that made it look strange. Maybe it belonged to something from another part of the country. But even while we said those things, we both knew we did not believe them. The shape was too strange. The size was too strange. The location was too strange. And the way it made us feel was too strange. Once we got back to town, the whole thing felt even harder to explain. In the truck, surrounded by streetlights and other cars, it was easier to tell ourselves it had probably been nothing. But the memory of it stayed clear in my mind. I could still see the pale skull on the ground. I could still see the odd shape of the front of its face. I could still remember the way my friend went silent before saying, "What the fuck?" Over the years, I have spent hours looking up skeletons and skulls of animals that live in the region. I have looked at elk, deer, pronghorn, bears, mountain lions, coyotes, wolves, badgers, wild pigs, birds, reptiles, and animals that do not even usually live around there. I have compared skull shapes, eye sockets, snouts, jaws, teeth, and bone structure. Nothing looks like what we found. Maybe there is an answer. Maybe somebody with more knowledge of bones would look at it and know exactly what it was. Maybe it was some rare combination of damage, decay, and an animal I never considered. I cannot say for sure that it was anything supernatural, but I know it did not look like any animal either of us recognized. And the worst part is that we left it there. Sometimes I wish we had taken a picture. Sometimes I wish we had marked the exact spot and gone back during the day. Sometimes I wish I had looked longer, even though I know that would have been a bad idea at the time. But we were young. It was dark. And something about that thing made both of us feel like we needed to leave. So we did. We got back on the road, drove away from the trees, and never found it again. To this day, I still think about that skull sitting out there in the dark, somewhere behind the San Francisco peaks. waiting in the dirt where no one would ever think to look. When I was 20, my friend and I decided to go hang out at the small lake nearby. It was one of those winter nights that looked almost too perfect to be real. There was a full moon hanging over everything, bright enough to make the snow shine like it had its own light. The lake was completely frozen over, smooth and dark beneath a thin layer of snow. The sky was clear, with no clouds covering the stars, and because it had snowed a few days earlier, the ground around us was still covered. The moonlight reflected off all of it so clearly that we could see most of our surroundings without needing flashlights. We had both been bored that night. There was nothing happening in town, and at that age, going somewhere quiet with a friend felt like enough of a plan. We wanted to smoke, relax, and enjoy the sky for a while. The lake was not far away, and we had been there plenty of times during the day. It was a small place, not some huge lake surrounded by cabins or crowds. It was mostly trees, a parking area, a few paths, and a structure that stretched out over the water during the warmer months. In the winter, with the lake frozen solid, it felt even more isolated. I brought my bong with me, and we walked out toward the structure that hung over the water. It was basically a small platform or dock area, something people used in the summer to sit near the lake or fish from. That night, it was empty and cold, covered in patches of snow and frost. The frozen lake stretched out in front of us, pale under the moonlight. Every now and then, we could hear the ice making low sounds beneath the surface, like distant cracks or dull groans. It was strange but normal for a frozen lake. We were not worried about it. At first, everything felt peaceful. We sat there talking about random things, laughing, smoking, and looking up at the sky. The stars were incredibly clear. Living near town, you usually get used to light pollution, streetlights, car headlights, people moving around, and some kind of noise always in the background. But out there was almost nothing. No traffic, no houses close enough to see, no people walking dogs, no sounds except the wind moving gently through the trees, and the occasional noise from the frozen lake. The cold slowly started getting into our clothes, but neither of us wanted to leave yet. We had only been there maybe 40 minutes. We were comfortable enough, and the night was too nice to waste. The moon made the whole place look silver. The snow around the lake reflected the light so strongly that it almost felt like daytime, except everything was quieter and darker at the edges. You could see the trees clearly, but beyond them was nothing but black woods. Then we heard footsteps. At first, neither of us said anything. It was not loud enough to make us panic. It sounded far away, somewhere across the lake or near one of the trails. Just the soft crunch of boots pressing into snow. We both looked up around the same time, probably because we had heard it clearly enough to know it was not an animal moving through the brush. It sounded too steady, too heavy. It had a rhythm to it. Crunch, crunch, crunch. We looked toward the far side of the lake, expecting to see someone walking along the shoreline. Because of the snow and the bright moon, we thought we would be able to see them easily. Even if we could not see their body clearly, we should have been able to see a shadow moving against the white ground. But there was nothing. We kept staring. The sound stopped. For a few seconds, everything went silent again. We looked at each other, then went back to talking. We both kind of laughed it off, saying it could have been someone walking a dog, someone else hanging around the park, or maybe an animal moving through the snow. The lake was not far from town, so it was not impossible that another person was there. It was late, but people did strange things at night. We had come out there ourselves, so we could not act like it was unbelievable for anyone else to do the same. Then the footsteps started again. This time they were louder, not by a huge amount, but enough that we both stopped talking immediately. The crunching sounded closer than before. It sounded like whoever or whatever was making it was walking along the snow near the lake, slowly coming in our direction. We leaned forward and looked around again. We looked across the frozen water. We looked down the trail. We looked toward the parking lot. Nothing. There were no lights, no flashlight beam, no car headlights, no movement, no dark shape walking between the trees. There was nothing at all. The footsteps stopped again. My friend looked at me and quietly asked if I saw anyone. I said no. He said that was definitely footsteps. I agreed, because it was. There was no question about that. It was not the wind. It was not ice cracking. It was not snow falling from a tree. It sounded exactly like someone walking through fresh snow. Anyone who has lived somewhere with heavy winters knows that sound. It has a certain weight to it. Snow makes a dry, sharp crunch under boots, especially when the temperature is low. It was the sound of someone moving nearby, and the fact that we could hear it so clearly made it impossible to ignore. We sat there quietly for a minute, listening. Then it started again. Crunch, crunch, crunch. This time, it was coming toward us. It was not moving fast. That almost made it worse. There was no running, no sudden rush, no loud shouting. Whoever was walking seemed calm. The footsteps were slow and even, like someone who knew exactly where they were going. We both turned toward the shore near the dock, trying to see where the sound was coming from. Still nothing. The snow around us was bright enough that we should have seen a person. There was no way someone could walk that close without appearing somewhere in our line of sight. The area around the lake was mostly open near the dock. There were trees farther back, but the sound was not coming from the woods anymore. It sounded like it was coming from the shore itself, from the snow-covered ground right beside the frozen water. My friend and I stopped moving. I remember feeling the cold more strongly then. Before, the cold had just been annoying. Suddenly, it felt like it was pressing against my skin. My hands were numb from holding the bong and sitting outside, but I barely noticed until that moment. I remember the way the air felt in my lungs when I tried not to breathe too loudly. I remember the quiet between each footstep. Crunch, 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 the sound came closer and closer. We were staring straight ahead, looking for a person, an animal, anything that could explain it. Nothing appeared. No shadow crossed the snow. No branches moved. No figure stepped out from behind a tree. The lake remained empty. The parking lot remained empty. The road behind the trees was empty. Then we started hearing the sound of the snow more clearly. It was no longer distant. It sounded like the footsteps were right near us. The crunching slowed down. One step, then another, until it sounded like whoever was making the noise had stopped directly under us. The structure we were sitting on hung out over the edge of the lake. Beneath it was the frozen water and the snow-covered shoreline area. The sound seemed to come from below the platform, from a place where someone should not have been standing. If it had been a person, they would have had to be right under the dock, close enough that we should have been able to see their shoes or hear them breathing. But we could not see anything. We went completely silent. Neither of us looked at the other. We just sat there, frozen in place, staring into the dark space below and around us. I could hear my own heartbeat more than anything else. It was not even loud, but in that kind of silence, every small sound becomes huge. I could hear the fabric of my jacket shift when I moved slightly. I could hear the ice crack far out on the lake. I could hear my friend breathing through his nose, slow and controlled. The footsteps had stopped. Nothing moved. For a few seconds, I kept waiting for something else to happen. I expected someone to laugh. or step out from under the platform, or say something stupid. I thought maybe it was someone trying to scare us. That would have made sense. It would have been creepy, but it would have made sense. No one said anything. There was no voice, no movement, no shadow. Just the feeling that something was directly beneath us. I do not know if it was because I was young, because I was high, or because I did not want to look scared in front of my friend, but I eventually decided I needed to see what was under there. I had grown up hearing stories. Being indigenous, you hear things from older people, warnings about certain places and certain things. You learn that there are some stories you do not joke about, and some things you are not supposed to invite into your life by showing too much fear or curiosity. But at the time, all I could think was that I had to know. I told my friend quietly that I was going to look. He immediately told me not to. I said I just wanted to make sure there was not someone under there. He kept saying, "Bro, don't." But I was already moving. The platform had enough open space that I could swing myself down and hang from the edge. I held on to the structure and lowered my body carefully, letting my legs hang down over the side. The cold metal or wood pressed into my hands. My arms were already stiff from the weather, and for a second, I thought I might lose my grip. But I leaned down as far as I could and looked underneath. There was nothing. No person. No animal. No footprints. No dark shape crouched under the dock. Nothing at all. The snow below looked untouched. That was the part that bothered me the most. If someone had walked up to us, there should have been footprints. There should have been a trail through the snow leading to the place where the sound stopped. But there was nothing. The snow was smooth beneath the platform. It had some old, uneven marks from wind and frozen patches, but no fresh tracks, no boot prints, no paw prints, no signs that anything had been there. I pulled myself back up quickly. My friend asked me what I saw. I told him nothing. He stared at me like he did not believe me at first. Then he looked over the edge himself, but he did not hang down the way I did. He just leaned over and looked. He saw the same thing. Nothing below us. Nothing around us. No tracks leading toward the platform. We sat there for maybe another 30 seconds, but it felt much longer. Neither of us wanted to say we were scared. We were both trying to act normal, trying to make jokes, trying to explain it away. Maybe it was the lake ice making weird sounds. Maybe someone had been there before us, and the sound carried strangely. Maybe there was an animal moving around that we could not see. Maybe the snow had been harder in some spots and made strange noises. But none of those explanations felt right. Ice did not sound like boots crunching through snow. An animal did not walk with slow, heavy, steady steps like that. And if someone had been there, we should have seen them. We finally packed up our stuff. We did not discuss it much. We just started moving faster. I put the bong away, grabbed my things, and we walked back toward the parking lot. The whole time, I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind us. I kept expecting the sound to start again, close enough that we would have to turn around. But it never did. The walk back to the car felt longer than it had before. The parking lot was empty, just like we had noticed earlier. There were no other cars, no fresh tire tracks, no people standing near the road, no one sitting in a vehicle with the lights off. It was just us. That made everything worse. If there had been another car there, we could have convinced ourselves that someone else was nearby. If there had been tire tracks in the snow, we could have said someone had stopped by and walked down to the lake. But there was nothing. Our car was the only one in the lot. We got inside and locked the doors immediately. Neither of us said much until we were driving back toward town. The heater was on, but I still felt cold. Not regular winter cold. It was more like the cold feeling you get after something scares you badly, and your body does not know how to calm down. My friend kept looking in the mirrors. I kept looking out the windows every time we passed a dark stretch of road. Then, after a few minutes, he finally said, "What the actual fuck was that?" I did not have an answer. I just told him that I did not know. We went over every possible explanation on the drive home. We tried to make it make sense. We asked each other if we had heard exactly the same thing. We had. We both heard footsteps from across the lake. We both heard them getting closer. We both heard the snow crunching near us. We both heard them stop right under the platform. And we both saw absolutely nothing. To this day, I do not know what it was. Maybe there is a normal explanation that neither of us thought of. Maybe sound carried strangely across the frozen lake. Maybe someone was nearby but hidden in a way we could not see. Maybe our minds were already playing tricks on us because it was dark, cold, quiet, and we had been smoking. But I know what I heard. I know what my friend heard. And I know how real it felt when those footsteps stopped directly beneath us, even though there was no one there. We never stayed out at that lake that late again. Forgive me for stepping in for just a moment. If you've only recently found your way here, then welcome. I'm glad you came. If these stories are keeping you company tonight, consider subscribing to Crowvane Manor. New stories arrive here often, the kind that stay with you long after the night is over. And if you tap the bell, you won't have to go looking. The next one will find you on its own. Thank you for being here. Now, let's return to where we left off. When I was about 5 or 6 years old, I had an experience that scared me so badly that I still remember it clearly. I was lying in bed late at night, wide awake for no real reason. I was not having a nightmare. I was not sick. I was just one of those kids who sometimes stayed awake, staring at the doorway, listening to the house settle and waiting for sleep to finally come. My room was across from my baby sister's room. She was still very little then, too little to walk around on her own. My parents' room was farther down the hall, and at night the whole upstairs had a routine to it. I knew the normal sounds. I knew when my parents went to bed. I knew when my dad would get up in the middle of the night to check on my sister. I knew the sound of footsteps moving through the hallway and the shadows they made when someone passed my open door. There was a small nightlight in the hallway. It was probably one of those cheap little plug-in ones, nothing fancy, but it gave off enough light that the hallway was never completely black. The light did not fill the rooms, but it created a soft glow along the carpet and the walls. It made the doorway visible from my bed. It also meant that if anyone walked down the hallway, their shadow would move across the edge of my door. That was normal. I had seen it many times. My dad would get up sometimes and walk down the hallway. His shadow would pass across the doorway, tall and familiar. I might hear the carpet shift under his feet, then hear him go toward my sister's room. Sometimes I would see the shadow first and hear him afterward. Other times I would hear the soft crunch of footsteps on the carpet before the dark shape crossed the door. I knew what that looked like. That was why this night was so strange. I was lying on my bed, facing the open doorway. I do not remember what time it was, only that it was late enough that everyone should have been asleep. The room was quiet. I could hear the faint sounds of the house, the kind you only notice when you are a kid lying awake in the dark. Maybe the heater clicking on somewhere. Maybe the refrigerator humming downstairs. Maybe a pipe making a small sound inside the walls. But mostly, it was quiet. I remember staring out through the doorway into the hallway. The nightlight was on. The hallway was dim but visible. The carpet was dark in the corners, and the light made the walls look yellowish. Then I heard footsteps, soft footsteps on carpet. It was that familiar crunching sound that you cannot really avoid making when you walk on certain kinds of carpet. Not loud, not like boots on hardwood, but still noticeable. A soft, compressed sound with every step. It sounded like somebody was walking down the hallway. At first, I was not scared. I assumed it was my dad. That would have made sense. He often got up to check on my little sister, especially at night. Maybe she had made a noise. Maybe he had heard her move. Maybe he was going to look in on her room across the hall. I remember either looking away for a second or closing my eyes. I am not sure which. Maybe I was tired enough that I tried to force myself back to sleep. Maybe I did not think the footsteps mattered. Maybe I turned my head because I expected the familiar shadow of my dad to cross the door and did not bother watching. But then, something made me look again. When I opened my eyes, I barely caught the end of a small shadow moving across my doorway. It was short, much shorter than my dad. It had a large head. That was the first thing I noticed. The head looked too big for the body. It was not shaped like my dad's shadow. It was not shaped like my mom's shadow. It was not shaped like an ordinary adult walking through the hallway. It was a small figure, but the head looked large and rounded compared to the rest of it. I only saw it for a moment. It passed across the edge of my doorway so quickly that I almost missed it. I saw the last part of the shadow move past the doorframe, heading toward my baby sister's room. Then it was gone. I froze. At first, I tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was my baby sister. But she was too little to walk. She could not have gotten out of her room and walked down the hallway by herself. She was a baby. She was not big enough, steady enough, or old enough to be moving around independently like that. Maybe it was my dad crouching down. That was another thought. Maybe he had bent over. Maybe he was carrying something. Maybe the hallway light made his shadow look smaller somehow. Maybe he was walking in a strange way because he was trying to be quiet. But the shadow did not look like an adult bent down. It looked like a small person, or something small. The footsteps had sounded real. I had heard them on the carpet. I had heard the soft crunching movement coming through the hall. And then I had seen the shadow. I remember lying completely still, staring at the doorway. I was waiting for the shadow to come back. I was waiting to hear more footsteps. I was waiting for someone to walk past again, maybe this time clearly enough that I could see who it was. But nothing happened. The hallway went quiet. That was when I started getting scared. I do not know how long I waited. When you are a child and you are afraid in the dark, time becomes strange. A few seconds can feel much longer because you are listening so hard. Every small noise in the house feels important. Every dark corner looks deeper. You start imagining things that are probably not there, but you cannot stop yourself from looking anyway. I lay there listening. Then I heard my dad snoring in my parents' room. That sound made everything worse. My dad was asleep. He had not gotten up. He had not gone to check on my sister. He had not walked through the hallway. He had been in bed the whole time. I remember the feeling that hit me when I realized that. It was like all the warmth left my body. I knew I had heard footsteps. I knew I had seen a shadow. But my dad was still asleep, and my sister was too young to walk. So who had just gone down the hallway? Nobody ever walked back. That is the part that has stayed with me. I waited for the footsteps to return, but they did not. I waited for a door to open, but it did not. I waited for my sister to cry, but I do not remember hearing anything from her room. I waited for someone to come back down the hallway so I could prove to myself that I was mistaken. But there was nothing. The house just stayed quiet. I think I stayed frozen in bed for a long time after that. I probably pulled my blanket closer. Maybe I hid part of my face under it. Maybe I stared at the door until my eyes hurt. I do not remember whether I eventually fell asleep or stayed awake until morning. What I remember is the fear. Not the kind of fear where you see a monster right in front of you. It was worse in a way because I had only seen a shadow. A small, strange shadow with a large head. I did not know what it was. I did not know where it went. I did not know whether it had gone into my sister's room, whether it was still somewhere in the hallway, or whether it had somehow disappeared. At 5 or 6 years old, you do not always have the words to explain why something feels impossible. You just know what should have happened. If it was your dad, you would hear him go back to his room. If it was your mom, you would hear her moving. If it was your baby sister, you would hear her crying or crawling or making some kind of sound. But none of that happened. There were footsteps. There was a shadow. Then nothing. I never told anyone right away. I do not know why. Maybe I was too scared. Maybe I thought nobody would believe me. Maybe I was worried my parents would laugh or tell me I was dreaming. Kids can be very aware of when something sounds silly, even when they are terrified. What was I supposed to say? I saw a little shadow with a big head walk past my door. I heard someone walking in the hall, but Dad was asleep. It looked like an alien. Even as a little kid, I knew that sounded strange. So I kept it to myself. For a long time, I tried to explain it away. Maybe I had been half asleep. Maybe I had dreamed the footsteps. Maybe I had opened my eyes at the exact moment a shadow from outside passed the door. Maybe headlights from a car moved across the hallway somehow. Maybe the nightlight made a strange shape from something in the room. Maybe I had imagined it. That is probably the most logical explanation. Children can wake up in the middle of the night and see things that are not really there. The line between dreaming and waking can be confusing. A child might hear a normal sound in the house and turn it into footsteps. A shadow from a piece of furniture, a toy, or an object in the hallway might look like a person for a split second. It could have been that, but the details have stayed with me too clearly. I remember the carpet sound. I remember the crunching footsteps. I remember the dim hallway light. I remember barely seeing the shadow cross the doorway. And I remember the head being too big. That part never made sense to me. It was not just a small shadow. It was shaped wrong. The body seemed small, but the head seemed large and round. It was the kind of shape that made me think of aliens. Even though I did not know much about aliens at that age, I think that is why I have always guessed aliens. Not because I have proof. Not because I saw bright lights outside, or a spaceship in the sky, or anything dramatic like that. Just because the figure looked small and had a big head. That is all I had. A shadow. Footsteps, and the knowledge that my dad had been asleep in his room. Over the years, I have thought about whether it could have been one of those strange childhood memories that becomes more vivid each time you revisit it. Maybe I only saw a piece of a shadow, and my mind created the rest. Maybe the large head was actually a coat, a pillow, or a shape on the wall. Maybe I heard my dad snoring after he had already come back to bed, and I simply did not notice him return. Maybe the timing got mixed up. Memory is not perfect, especially from when you were very young. But it still felt real. The hallway was familiar. The nightlight was familiar. The shadow was not. I remember being afraid to face the door after that. I remember not wanting to stare down the hallway in the dark. I remember wondering whether it would happen again and whether I would see the figure more clearly next time. It never did. At least, not that I remember. Nothing else like that happened in the house. I did not see the small shadow again. I did not hear strange footsteps every night. I did not see anything in my sister's room. My parents never said they noticed anything unusual. It was just that one night, that one moment, a soft crunch on the carpet, a small shadow passing the door, a large head, then silence. Sometimes the smallest experiences are the hardest to let go of because there is no ending. There is no answer. Nothing jumped out. Nothing spoke. Nothing proved itself. There was just enough to make you wonder. Maybe it was a dream. Maybe it was a shadow. Maybe it was a kid's imagination. Or maybe something small walked past my door in the middle of the night, went toward my baby sister's room, and never came back. I still do not know. But when I think about it now, I always come back to the same thing. My dad was asleep. My sister could not walk. And I definitely heard someone moving down that hallway. My parents used to have this television that would turn itself on at random times. It was one of those things everyone in the house knew about, but never really took seriously at first. The TV was old, and old electronics can be strange. Sometimes they react to a remote from another room. Sometimes the buttons stick. Sometimes the power flickers. Or maybe there is some wiring issue nobody understands. So when it would suddenly turn on by itself, we usually treated it like an annoying problem with the television. Still, it happened enough that I noticed. You could be sitting in another room, doing something completely normal, and suddenly hear the television click on. The screen would light up, filling the room with that pale blue glow. Sometimes there would be static. Sometimes a channel would come on. Sometimes it would be loud enough that someone had to rush in and turn it off. It was irritating during the day. At night, it was different. At night, when the house was quiet and everyone was asleep, the sound of a television turning on by itself felt much worse. It was not just a click or a little light in the room. It was the feeling of something happening when it should not be happening. The screen lighting up in an empty room. Voices or static suddenly breaking through the silence. The glow spilling out into the hallway when nobody was supposed to be awake. I had gotten used to it in a way, but I never liked it. One night, I was asleep in my room when the TV came on again. I woke up because of the sound. At first, I did not know what I was hearing. When you wake up in the middle of the night, your brain is slow. You hear something, but it takes a few seconds to understand what it is. I remember lying there in bed, confused, listening to the sound coming from the television. Then I realized it had turned on by itself. Again, I was tired and annoyed more than anything. I did not want the TV blaring in the middle of the night. I did not want anyone else waking up because of it. I did not want to lie there listening to whatever channel had come on until someone else noticed. So I got up to turn it off. The house was dark except for the light coming from the television. That made the room look strange. The screen gave everything a dull, flickering glow, casting shadows across the walls and furniture. It was not bright enough to make the room feel safe, but it was bright enough to make the darkness outside the television's reach seem deeper. I remember walking over to it and reaching toward the buttons. For whatever reason, I did not just turn it off normally. I unplugged it. Maybe I was tired of it turning on by itself. Maybe I thought unplugging it would make sure it stayed off. Maybe I did not want to wake up again an hour later to the same sound. I just remember grabbing the plug and pulling it from the wall. The television went dark. The room went quiet. Then I heard something outside. At first, I thought it was dogs. That was the most normal explanation. There were dogs in the neighborhood, and dogs bark at all kinds of things during the night. They hear animals in the yard, smell something unfamiliar, see a person walking down the street, or react to noises people cannot hear. But this did not sound like normal dogs barking. It sounded like a pack of hyenas. That is the closest comparison I can make. It was not one animal. It was not one dog crying or barking in the distance. It sounded like multiple things moving together behind the houses, making this strange laughing, shrieking, chattering noise. It was wild and loud and wrong. It had that high, broken sound that hyenas make in movies or nature videos, except it was coming from behind my own yard. Behind our house was open land. There were no buildings directly behind us, no busy road, no houses close enough to block the sound. Just open space where grass, weeds, brush, and darkness stretched out farther than I could see at night. During the day, it was not that scary. It was just empty land. Maybe kids would walk around there sometimes. Maybe animals moved through. Maybe people cut through it. But at night, it felt like the edge of the world. There were no streetlights out there, no porch lights, no clear fence line that made you feel separated from it. Just darkness behind the yard. The sound seemed to be moving through that open land. I froze. I stood there in the room after unplugging the TV, listening. At first, the noises were farther away. They came from somewhere behind the yard, beyond the darkness where I could not see. But then they got closer. Not directly toward the house, exactly. More like they were moving across the land behind the row of houses. The sound traveled from one side to the other, and as it passed behind each house, the dogs at that house reacted. That was the part that scared me the most. I heard the animals moving behind the yard. Then the dog at one house started whimpering, not barking aggressively, not growling like it wanted to chase something away. Whimpering, the kind of scared, nervous sound dogs make when they do not understand something or do not want to be near it. Then the strange noises moved farther along the open land. The next house had a dog that started howling. Then another dog reacted. Then another. It was like whatever was moving behind the houses passed each yard one by one, and every dog knew it was there before the people inside did. Some dogs whined, some howled, some barked in a way that sounded panicked. But none of them sounded normal. I remember standing completely still, too scared to even go to the window. Part of me wanted to look outside. I wanted to know what was making the sound. I wanted to see whether it was a pack of animals, people, coyotes, something in the brush, or something completely ordinary that only sounded terrifying because it was dark. But another part of me did not want to see anything. Sometimes the sound is worse than the sight because your imagination starts making it bigger. But sometimes you know that seeing the source would be worse than not knowing. I did not want to pull back the curtain and find something standing in the open land behind the house. So I stayed where I was. The TV was unplugged. The room was dark. The whole house was asleep. And behind the yard, something was moving. The sounds kept going. They were not steady like an animal call. They came in bursts, strange high laughs, harsh cries, chattering noises, something that sounded almost like several animals fighting or calling to each other. But there was something about it that did not sound natural to me. Maybe it was because I had never heard anything like it before. Maybe it was because I was half awake and already unsettled by the television turning on. Maybe the darkness made every noise feel worse. But I remember thinking, what the hell is that? I remember listening as it moved along the land behind the neighborhood. One house, then another. Each time the dogs reacted. It was almost like the sounds had a path. They seemed to travel behind the yards in a line, getting closer to some houses and farther from others. Every time the strange noise reached the area behind a dog, that dog would begin whimpering or howling. It felt like the animals knew something was there. And whatever it was, it did not sound like something that belonged behind a neighborhood at night. I do not know how long I listened. It may have been only a few minutes. It could have been longer. When you are afraid, time slows down. You notice every sound, every pause, every change in distance. I remember the noises moving farther away eventually, toward the end of the open land. The dogs kept reacting for a while. Then, one by one, they started to quiet down. Eventually, everything was silent again. That should have made me feel better. It did not. The silence afterward felt worse, because I did not know where the things had gone. I did not know whether they had moved away from the neighborhood or whether they were still somewhere behind the house, hidden in the darkness. I remember going back toward my room. I was trying to calm myself down. I was trying to act like it was nothing. Maybe it had been coyotes. Maybe it had been dogs from another property. Maybe it had been foxes, raccoons, or some other animals making strange sounds. Animals can sound terrifying at night, especially when you do not know what you are hearing. But the noises had sounded too strange, and the way the dogs reacted from house to house made it feel like whatever was out there was passing through deliberately. When I got back into my room, I had one thought. I told myself, watch it be 3 a.m. I do not know why I said that to myself. Maybe because I had heard people call 3 a.m. the witching hour. Maybe it was something I had seen in a movie or heard from friends. The idea that 3 in the morning is the creepiest time of night is one of those things people say when they are already scared. Normally, I would have laughed at myself for thinking it. But after hearing the TV turn on by itself, and then hearing those horrible animal-like sounds move behind the houses, I did not feel like laughing. I looked at the clock. It was 3 a.m. Exactly. That was the moment my stomach dropped. Maybe it was coincidence. It probably was. There is nothing magical about a number on a clock. 3 in the morning is simply a time when most people are asleep. The streets are quiet, and every normal sound seems more frightening because there is nothing else happening. If you wake up at that hour, your mind is already in a strange place. You are tired, you are disoriented, and darkness makes everything feel more intense. But seeing that time after I had literally just thought, it made the whole night feel worse. The television had turned on by itself. I had unplugged it. Then I heard something behind the yard that sounded like a pack of hyenas moving through the open land. Every dog near the path of the sound started whimpering or howling. Then it was 3 a.m. I did not sleep well after that. I do not remember whether I stayed awake until morning or eventually forced myself to lie down. I probably kept listening for sounds outside. Every little noise in the house would have made me tense up. The refrigerator clicking, the air conditioner or heater turning on, a branch scraping somewhere, a dog barking far away. Once you hear something strange in the middle of the night, ordinary sounds stop feeling ordinary. I remember being afraid that the television would turn on again. I remember looking toward the dark room where it sat, unplugged from the wall. I remember wondering whether it would still somehow come on. It did not. At least, not that night. I never found out what made those sounds behind the yard. Maybe it was a group of coyotes. Coyotes can make awful noises at night. They can sound like people screaming, laughing, crying, yipping, and fighting all at the same time. A whole pack of them can sound much bigger and stranger than you expect. If they moved behind the yards, it would make sense that the neighborhood dogs reacted. That is probably the most logical explanation. Maybe they were coyotes moving through the open land. Maybe the dogs smelled them or heard them before I could. Maybe the wind carried the sound in a way that made it seem like the noises were much closer than they were. Maybe the TV turning on right before it happened was just bad timing. Maybe the clock reading 3 a.m. was another coincidence. All of that is possible. But I have heard dogs. I have heard coyotes from far away. And I have never heard anything quite like what I heard that night. The sound did not just seem animal-like. It seemed wrong. It seemed like laughter mixed with screaming, moving through the dark behind the houses. It seemed like something passing close enough that every dog in the neighborhood knew it was there. And the TV turning on first made the whole thing feel connected, even if it probably was not. I never told many people about it. It is one of those stories that sounds stupid if you tell it the wrong way. Someone will say it was just coyotes. Someone else will say the television had a bad power button. Someone will laugh at the 3 a.m. part and say I was watching too many scary movies. Maybe they would be right. But I remember standing in that dark room after unplugging the TV. I remember hearing the first strange noise from the open land behind the yard. I remember the dogs reacting one house at a time. I remember the whimpering and howling following whatever it was as it moved past. And I remember walking back into my room, thinking, watch it, be 3 a.m. Then, seeing the clock. That was enough for me. After that night, whenever the TV turned on by itself, I did not just get annoyed anymore. I listened to the yard. My step-grandpa gave me an antique chair that had belonged to his previous wife after she passed away. At the time, I did not think much about it. It was just an old chair. Maybe it looked a little different from the furniture I already had, but old furniture often does. Antique pieces have their own style. They are heavier, darker, more detailed, and somehow feel more permanent than newer furniture. They look like they have been in other houses, in other rooms, around other families, long before they ever end up with you. The chair had belonged to someone I never knew. I knew it had been my step-grandpa's late wife's chair, but I did not really understand what that meant at the time. I knew she had died. I knew she had once lived with him, and that the chair had been part of her life. But I did not know her personality, what she looked like, what kind of clothes she wore, or whether she had loved that chair. As far as I was concerned, it was furniture. It was an antique chair, and my step-grandpa had given it to me. It got placed in my room. I do not remember exactly where in the room it sat, but I remember that it was close enough to my bed that I could see it clearly if I looked over during the night. It was probably against the wall, maybe in a corner, maybe near the foot of the bed. It became part of the room almost immediately. You bring in a new piece of furniture, and after a few hours, it starts to look like it has always been there. That first night, I went to bed normally. Nothing had happened during the day. The chair did not look strange, did not make a noise. It did not feel cold. Nobody told me scary stories about it. Nobody warned me not to sit in it. Nobody said anything about the woman who had owned it before. I went to sleep without thinking about it. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I do not know what woke me. Maybe I heard a small sound. Maybe I felt that strange feeling people sometimes get when they wake up suddenly and do not know why. Maybe I was in that half-awake state where you are not fully dreaming, but you are not completely alert either. At first, I just lay there. The room was dark, but not completely dark. There was probably a little moonlight coming through the window, or a faint glow from outside. Enough light that I could make out the shape of the furniture in my room. Enough light that I could see my bed, the walls, and the chair. Then I looked at the chair. Someone was sitting in it. At first, my mind did not understand what I was seeing. I remember looking toward the chair and seeing the shape of a woman. She had a soft glow around her. Not bright like a lamp, but pale enough that she stood out against the darkness of the room. It was like she had her own light around her. or like the room was darker everywhere except where she sat. She was wearing an old-fashioned dress. The dress had a high neck. That detail has always stayed with me. It did not look like normal modern clothes. It looked like something from another time, with a high collar and a more formal style. The kind of dress you might see in an old photograph, something modest and carefully made, from a period long before I was born. She was sitting very still. She was not talking. She was not moving around the room. She was just there, in the chair. For a moment, I tried to make myself believe it was my mom. That was the only explanation my half-awake brain could come up with. Maybe my mom had come into my room for some reason. Maybe she had been checking on me. Maybe she was sitting in the chair because she could not sleep. Maybe she had heard something and came to make sure I was okay. Even though it did not really make sense, I wanted it to be her. So I said, "Mom?" I said it quietly at first, like I was unsure. The woman did not answer. She slowly turned her head toward me. That was when I knew it was not my mom. I do not remember every detail of her face. I do not remember whether her eyes looked normal or whether she had a clear expression. What I remember is the movement, the slow, deliberate way she turned her head and looked at me. She did not jump up. She did not disappear. She did not smile. She just turned toward me and sat there looking at me. It felt like she had been waiting for me to notice her. That was when I screamed. I screamed for my mom as loudly as I could. I do not remember deciding to scream. It just came out of me. All the fear I had been holding in for those few seconds suddenly hit at once. My mom came running into the room. I remember the sound of her moving fast, the door opening, and the light being turned on. The whole room changed in an instant. The darkness vanished. The chair was fully visible. And it was empty. There was nobody sitting in it. No glowing woman. No dress. No high-neck collar. No sign that anyone had been there. Just the antique chair, sitting exactly where it had been placed. I was terrified. I tried to explain what I had seen. I told my mom there was a woman in the chair. I told her she was glowing. I told her she was wearing an old dress. I told her I thought she was my mom at first, but she had turned her head and looked at me. My mom looked around the room, but there was nothing to see. Maybe she tried to calm me down. Maybe she told me I had been dreaming. Maybe she told me I had just woken up from a nightmare. That would have been the normal thing to say. Parents want to make their kids feel safe. They want to explain scary things in a way that makes them less frightening. But I did not feel like I had been dreaming. I had been in my bed. I had seen the chair. I had seen the woman sitting in it. And I had watched her turn toward me. I did not want the chair in my room anymore. I made my mom move it that night. I did not want to wait until morning. I did not want to sleep with it in the room. I did not want to look at it again. I did not want to wake up and see her sitting there a second time. The chair had to go. My mom moved it out of my room, and after that, I never had anything like that happen again. No glowing woman, no strange figure, no old-fashioned dress, no one sitting in the chair, nothing. That was the only time. For years afterward, I kept thinking about whether I had dreamed it. That would be the easiest answer. I had just gotten a new piece of furniture that belonged to a woman who had died. Maybe I had heard people mention that fact. Maybe it got into my subconscious. Maybe I fell asleep thinking about the chair without realizing it, and my mind created a story around it. Maybe I was in that strange state between sleeping and waking where dreams can feel real. People can wake up and see things that are not there. A room can look exactly like it does in real life, but one impossible thing can appear in it. The brain can create a figure, a shadow, a voice, or a person in a chair. It can feel so real that you remember it for years afterward. That is possible. But what makes the memory hard to dismiss is how clear it felt. I remember the chair. I remember the soft glow around her. I remember the high-neck dress. I remember saying, "Mom," and I remember her slowly turning her head toward me. It was not a normal nightmare where the room changes or something impossible happens in a dreamlike way. The room looked like my room. The chair looked like the chair. The darkness looked like normal nighttime darkness. The only thing that did not belong was the woman sitting there. Sometimes I wonder if the chair meant something to her. Maybe it had been her favorite place to sit. Maybe she had spent years in it. Maybe she had read there, rested there, waited for her husband there, or simply considered it part of her home. If someone had owned something for a long time, loved it, and then died, it is easy to imagine that a piece of them might still feel connected to it. That is probably just a story people tell themselves about antique furniture. But once you have seen something in an old chair, it becomes hard not to think that way. I do not know whether she was really my step-grandpa's previous wife. I had never met her. I did not know what she looked like. I did not know whether she wore dresses like that. I did not know what era of clothing she liked, or whether she had ever sat in that exact chair wearing something with a high neck. Maybe the image came entirely from my imagination. Maybe my brain saw antique chair and invented old-fashioned woman. Maybe I had seen a picture somewhere without remembering it. Maybe I had heard adults talk about her and my mind filled in everything else. But I never had that kind of experience before. And I never had it again after the chair was removed from my room. That is what stayed with me. The chair came into my room. That night, I saw a woman sitting in it. The chair was moved out, and nothing else happened. It is hard not to connect those things. I have thought about why she looked at me the way she did. She did not seem angry. At least, I do not remember anger. She did not move toward me or try to hurt me. She did not speak. She did not do anything violent or dramatic. She simply sat there. Then, when I called out to my mom, she turned her head and looked at me. Maybe she was confused. Maybe she was curious. Maybe she was only a dream, and my fear gave her that slow movement. I will never know, but I still remember the feeling in my chest when I realized it was not my mom. There is a certain kind of fear that happens when you see something, and for 1 second, you give yourself a normal explanation. You think, it is okay. It is someone I know. It is my mom. Everything is fine. Then the thing looks at you, and you realize it is not. That is what made it so scary. I wanted it to be my mom. I wanted there to be a simple reason for someone to be sitting in my room at night. Instead, there was a glowing woman in an old-fashioned dress, sitting in a chair that had belonged to a deceased woman. And when the lights came on, the chair was empty. I never wanted that chair in my room again. And after it was gone, I never saw her again either. When I was around 8 years old, I used to visit my great-grandmother at the trailer park where she lived. It was not the kind of trailer park people probably imagine when they hear those words. It was not rundown, chaotic, or full of people coming and going at all hours. It was well-established, quiet, and mostly filled with older people who had lived there for years. It was almost like a small, self-sufficient retirement community, except everyone had their own older trailers instead of apartments. The trailers had been there since the 1970s, and a lot of them still looked like they had barely changed since then. My great-grandmother's place had that old, warm, slightly dusty feeling that certain grandparents' homes have. It smelled like old furniture, laundry detergent, carpet, and whatever had been cooked there earlier in the day. The rooms were small, but they were packed with things. Family photos, knickknacks, old lamps, folded blankets, dishes that were probably only used on special occasions, and furniture that looked like it had been there forever. The trailer itself was not scary during the day. It felt old but safe. It was familiar in the way older relatives' homes can feel familiar. I knew where the kitchen was, where the television was, where people sat when they talked, and where the bedrooms were. I knew that if I got bored, I could look through drawers full of old things, watch whatever was on TV, or sit near my great-grandmother while she talked to the adults. But there were parts of that trailer that had a strange feeling to them. The bathroom was one of them. It had shag carpet, actual carpet, in the bathroom. Even as a kid, it felt weird. The rest of the trailer had regular old carpeting, too, but the bathroom had the same thick shag carpet that covered parts of the bedroom and hallway. It was dark, matted in places, and had that musty smell old carpet gets after years of being in the same room. The bathroom was directly across from my great-grandmother's bed. The layout was simple. If you were lying in bed, you could see straight toward the bathroom doorway. The doorframe separated the bathroom from the bedroom, and the bedroom itself had that dim afternoon look most of the time because of the cheap blinds covering the windows. I remember one afternoon very clearly. I had taken a nap in my great-grandmother's room. I do not remember why I was sleeping there instead of on the couch or in another room. Maybe I was tired from playing outside. Maybe the adults wanted me to rest. Maybe I had been lying down with a blanket and just drifted off. At that age, adults would tell you to take a nap, and sometimes you would fight it. But then you would wake up hours later feeling confused and disoriented. That is what happened that day. I woke up slowly. The afternoon sun was coming through the cheap Walmart blinds, casting pale strips of light across the room. The light was not bright or cheerful. It had that faded yellow-orange color that afternoon sunlight gets when it comes through plastic blinds and dusty windows. The room smelled like the old trailer. Musky carpet, old blankets, something slightly sweet from whatever air freshener or powder my great-grandmother used. I remember lying there for a moment, still half asleep, looking around the room and trying to figure out where I was. Then I sat up. That was when I felt it. Something was off. I did not know how to explain it because I was only 8. I did not have words for atmosphere, dread, intuition, or that weird feeling you get when a familiar room suddenly does not feel familiar anymore. I only knew that the bedroom seemed different from the way it had felt before I fell asleep. It felt too quiet. Not peaceful quiet. Wrong quiet. The kind of silence where you suddenly become aware of every tiny sound your own body makes. Your breathing, the blanket shifting, the mattress moving under you, the faint hum of an appliance somewhere else in the trailer. I looked toward the bathroom. The bathroom doorway was open. The shag carpet inside looked darker than the carpet in the bedroom because the afternoon light did not reach it as well. The doorway itself was shadowed, and the inside of the bathroom seemed deeper than it should have. It was not a large bathroom. It was an old trailer bathroom. There was nowhere inside it that should have been especially dark or hidden. But I remember staring at that doorway and feeling like something was there. At first, I thought maybe it was my great-grandmother. Maybe she was in the bathroom. Maybe she was moving around quietly. Maybe one of the adults had come into the room and I had not heard them. I kept looking. Then I saw fingers curl around the doorframe. They were small hands, but the fingers were too long. That is the first image that has stayed with me all these years. Long, thin fingers wrapped around the side of the bathroom doorframe, slowly appearing one by one. They were not normal child-sized fingers. They were not little hands reaching around the corner in a playful way. They were far too long for the size of whatever was behind the door. When I say long, I mean impossibly long. 9 inches, maybe even a foot. Long enough that they looked wrong against the frame. Long enough that the shape of them did not match anything my child brain could make sense of. The fingers were thin and spindly, not muscular, not thick. They looked fragile in one way, almost like sticks or roots, but they moved with intention. They curled around the doorway like something was holding itself just out of sight. It was shy. That is the only word I can use for it. It did not rush into the room. It did not jump at me. It did not make a noise. It did not crawl out or show itself completely. It seemed like it was trying to look at me without being seen. Like a small creature hiding behind the bathroom wall, using the long fingers to grip the frame while it slowly peeked around. I froze. At 8 years old, I did not scream. I did not run. I did not call for my great-grandmother. I just sat there in the bed and stared. There are moments when fear makes you move, and there are moments when fear makes your whole body stop working. This was the second kind. I remember being completely still, looking at those fingers and trying to understand what I was seeing. The thing was small, no more than 2 feet tall. I never saw it fully step into the room, but I knew from the height of the hands and where they were gripping the frame that it was low to the ground. It was not a person standing behind the door. It was not an adult bending down. It was not a child playing a prank. Whatever was there was short, and the fingers were much too long for its size. I remember waiting for it to show its face. Part of me expected a person, maybe a child from the trailer park, maybe someone visiting. Maybe my imagination had turned a shadow into hands and I would blink, look again, and see a towel or a coat hanging nearby. But the fingers stayed there. They were real enough that I could see the way they held onto the wood. They were not just a blur or a shadow. They curled around the doorframe. They gripped it. I remember feeling that strange combination of fear and curiosity that kids sometimes get when they see something they do not understand. I was terrified, but I also could not look away. I wanted to see what it was, even though I did not want it to come out. I do not remember how long I stared. It might have been only a few seconds. It could have been a minute. When you are a child and something frightens you, time stretches. The sunlight through the blinds, the carpet, the open bathroom, the long fingers on the frame, all of it became locked in my memory like a photograph. At some point, the figure pulled back. I do not remember it moving fast. I do not remember it running. I just remember that the fingers were there, then they were gone. The bathroom doorway was empty again. The shag carpet was empty. The room was quiet. Nothing happened after that. No sound from the bathroom. No footsteps. No voice. No one came into the room. I sat there for a while, trying to convince myself I had imagined it. That was probably the first thing I did. I was young. I knew it did not make sense. I knew there was no reasonable explanation for a 2-foot-tall creature with hands that had fingers nearly as long as my forearm. So I told myself I had been dreaming. I had just woken up from a nap. Maybe I was still half asleep. Maybe my eyes had adjusted badly to the shadows. Maybe the cheap blinds had cast some strange shape on the bathroom wall. Eventually, I got up. I looked in the bathroom. Nothing. I checked around the doorframe. Nothing. There was no person, no animal, no toy, no weird object, no explanation for what I had seen. But I did not tell anyone. I kept it to myself. I think I knew, even at 8 years old, that it sounded impossible. What was I supposed to say? I woke up and saw a tiny creature hiding in the bathroom with fingers longer than its body should allow. I imagined adults laughing. I imagined them telling me I had been dreaming. I imagined other kids making fun of me. So I did what a lot of children do with strange experiences. I put it away in my mind. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe it was a fever dream. Maybe I had dreamed the whole thing. Maybe I was a kid with a wild imagination. That explanation stayed with me for years. I never forgot the memory, but I did not think about it all the time. It became one of those childhood moments you keep in the back of your mind. Something that felt real, but probably was not. Something you remember too clearly, but do not want to examine too closely, because there is no answer that makes sense. 8 years passed. By then, I was older. I had learned how easy it was to doubt memories from childhood. I knew that kids misunderstand things. I knew dreams can feel real. I knew the brain can turn shadows into monsters and ordinary noises into voices. I still remembered the creature, though. I remembered the fingers. That was always the part I could not shake. The fingers were too specific, too long, too thin, too deliberate. But I still did not tell anyone. Then one night, I was at a dinner party with church friends. The host was a teacher at my school. She was a wonderful woman, someone everybody liked. She was kind, warm, and the kind of teacher who made people feel comfortable. Her house was full of people talking, eating, laughing, and catching up after dinner. It was one of those evenings where the conversation slowly moved from ordinary things into stories. People talked about childhood memories. Then strange things. Then creepy experiences. Someone mentioned seeing something weird when they were younger. Someone else told a ghost story. The mood was light at first, the way people talk about scary things when there are other people around and the room is warm and bright. Eventually, the conversation turned to unexplained experiences. And for some reason, I finally decided to tell mine. I do not know why I chose that night. Maybe I felt safe because everyone there was talking openly. Maybe I thought enough years had passed that I could tell it without feeling embarrassed. Maybe I wanted someone to confirm that it sounded like a dream. Maybe I just wanted to say it out loud for the first time. So I started telling them. I described my great-grandmother's trailer park. I explained that it was an older community, mostly elderly people, quiet and established. I described the old trailer, the carpet in the bathroom, the afternoon sun coming through cheap blinds, the feeling of waking from a nap and knowing something was wrong. Then I got to the bathroom doorway. I started describing the fingers. I was not even halfway through the story when I noticed the host's face. She had gone pale, not just surprised, pale white. Her expression changed so suddenly that I stopped talking. At first, I thought maybe she was feeling sick. Maybe something about the story had upset her. Maybe she had a personal memory connected to it. She looked like she had seen something she did not want to see. I asked her if she was okay. She did not answer right away. She just looked at me and asked me to continue. That made me nervous. I could feel the whole room shifting. People who had been casually talking a minute earlier got quiet. Everyone noticed her reaction. Suddenly, my strange childhood story did not feel like a silly memory anymore. So I continued. I told them the rest. I described the small figure, the long, spindly fingers wrapped around the bathroom doorframe, the way it seemed shy, like it was hiding and peeking at me, the way I saw it from my great-grandmother's bed and never told anyone afterward. When I finished, the host was silent for a moment. Then she told us she had seen something eerily similar. Not the same place, not the same room, but a creature with the same kind of description. Small, strange, long, fingers far out of proportion to the rest of its body. That was the moment the old memory changed for me. Before then, I had been able to dismiss it. I had always thought, maybe I dreamed it. Maybe I imagined it because I was 8. Maybe the bathroom carpet and shadows made something look strange. Maybe I was just a kid with an active imagination. But hearing an adult describe something similar made my stomach drop. She did not know my story. I had never told her before. I had never told anyone before. And yet she reacted before I had even fully described the creature. She had gone pale at the part about the long fingers. That was what made it feel real. Not proven, not certain, but real enough that I could no longer put it completely into the category of childhood imagination. I had always wanted to believe in things like that. Even as a child, I was fascinated by the idea that there might be things in the world people could not explain. Ghosts, strange creatures, spirits, whatever people call them. I liked scary stories, but I also thought I was probably crazy for seeing something myself. I did not want to be the kind of person who saw monsters in shadows. I did not want to tell a story nobody believed. But the host's reaction gave me a kind of validation I was not prepared for. It made the memory more frightening, not less. Because it is one thing to believe you had a weird dream when you were 8. It is another thing to realize that someone else may have seen something almost identical. I still do not know what I saw. Maybe I was half asleep. Maybe I experienced something like a hypnopompic hallucination, where you wake up, but part of your brain is still dreaming. That could explain why the sunlight, the carpet, and the room all felt real, while one impossible thing appeared at the bathroom door. Maybe I saw a shadow or something in the doorway, and my young brain turned it into a creature. Children are good at seeing faces and figures and things that are not there. A coat, a towel, a piece of furniture, a reflection, or a dark corner can become something terrifying when you are tired or afraid. Maybe my memory changed over time. Maybe the fingers got longer each time I remembered them. Maybe the story became sharper because I kept it private for so many years. All of those are possible. But I cannot explain the woman's reaction. I cannot explain why she went pale before I got to the end. I cannot explain why she described something similar. And I cannot explain why, after all these years, I still remember those fingers so clearly. Long, thin, wrapped around the bathroom doorframe, waiting just out of sight. If you've stayed with me this far, then these stories didn't simply pass the time. They stayed with you. Everything you heard tonight was real. Real people. Real moments. And in each one, something quietly slipped out of place. If you'd like more of the kind that don't let go so easily, subscribe to Crowvane Manor. There are more rooms left open, and more stories waiting behind every door. I'm grateful you spent this part of your night here. Rest well, and I'll be waiting when you return.